Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our Unit 6 lectures. Unit 6 looks at the consequences of industrialization. Today we are going to be looking at India. So I would like you to identify 3 changes and 3 continuities in the interactions of Africa and Europe. So think about what we've just learned about new imperialism, what has changed and what has stayed the same. Our agenda for today, we're looking at India and new imperialism. So this is aligning with topic 6.2 of our AP course description. And our objective is you will be able to compare processes by which state power shifted in various parts of the world from 1750 to 1900. Specifically, we're going to be looking at India. Okay. So it's important, I think, to start with geography. The Indian subcontinent is enormous. It is separated from the rest of Asia by the Himalayas in the northeastern part of the region and the Hindu Kush further north. It is a region that has a variety of climates, jungles, deserts, mountains, plains, and it has always supported a large population center. We know that India has been active in the Indian Ocean trade network for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so the fact that the British are going to be able to come in to this ancient, highly populated area and take control so easily is pretty astounding. So when we talk about British India, this is the territory that includes. So it would include modern day Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar. It's an enormous territory that they are going to take control of. So I'm going to be abbreviating the British East India Company on the slides because it's a lot of words, and I try to limit the amount of words on a specific slide. So let's get started. It's important to remember the context of India at this time. You have Mughal rule. So if you remember, the Mughals are going to be Muslim leaders. You have Akbar. Remember we talked about like Akbar the Great, who was super tolerant. Babur was the guy who founded it. And really in our time period, we're going to be looking, you should align it sort of with Aurangzeb. If you remember, Aurangzeb was the prince who really went back to Muslim basics, right? He was very conservative. He opposed Akbar's sort of more religious tolerance. So you have these Mughal princes. It's important to understand that the Mughal princes, Aurangzeb, are literally the richest people on earth. They have so much wealth, jewels, spices. They still really dominate the spice trade. They're also super Muslim and conservative. So what are some of the ways that takes form? Well, one way is, like the Ottomans, you don't have a tradition of primogeniture in the Mughal Empire, right? Where the eldest son is automatically the heir. So similarly to the Ottomans, you have some bloodshed for the throne. But it also means things like the women, the sisters of the princes, any daughters that an emperor, Mughal emperor has, would not be allowed to marry because they could have children and then those children could be potential rivals for the throne. So the Mughals are in charge. You have Nawabs, N-A-W-A-B. A Nawab is a Muslim prince who will end up allying with the British East India Company. They're technically a semi-autonomous deputy of the Mughal emperor. So British rule in India is going to last for almost, 300 years, right? So for the first like 2/3 of it, it will be ruled by the British East India Company. And then for the last century, you will have the British Raj, so the British crown ruling. So let's understand this a little bit. When I say the British East India Company ruled, I really mean a corporation. Imagine if Google, or actually a better analogy might be Amazon, right? Imagine if Amazon took over all of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Myanmar and cut deals with local mayors and governors and really took control of the entire region, right? The goals and the, what's the word I want? Standards of a nation state are going to be really different from that of a corporation, right? A corporation is seeking to maximize their profits for their shareholders. Oftentimes not caring how that gets done, leading to environmental exploitation as well as the exploitation of people. Sorry, I don't know if you can pick up on any of the sort of grunty sounds. It's the baby. A state, oftentimes, a government has rules, and they have goals to, help the nation prosper, help the citizens of that nation prosper. The British East India Company just want to make some dudes back in Britain rich. Who cares about what happens to the citizens living here? So, India was really divided within itself. The Mughal Empire was getting weaker. And so the British East India Company started by taking control of trading towns in the 17th century and began to be interested in obtaining more territory. So in the late 18th century, Britain will gain more control as part of the victory in the 7 Years' War against France. To really maintain their power, the British will rely on sepoys. So a sepoy is an Indian soldier trained in the British military style. So the sepoys will be really important for the British control of India. You might think, why would an Indian soldier do this? Why would they become essentially mercenaries to help a foreign power take control of their land? Well, sepoys would be paid well, and they'd certainly be paid better as a soldier for the British than as a soldier for the Mughals. You have to remember that the motivations for most people, ordinary people, are pretty straightforward. They want to be able to feed and house their family. They want their family to be safe. And they want there to be some sort of optimistic future for their children, right? So a lot of times we will look at the actions of ordinary people and be like, but how could they do this? Well, because doing this meant that their children had full bellies and they could send their sons to school. It was a better gig working for the British as a sepoy than working for a Mughal prince. The British East India Company will ultimately be pretty weak. One of the things that they will start to do in India is use India's fertile land to grow opium to then sell in China. The British East India Company is our first real drug cartel. You have to understand that. The thing to understand about India as well, and we've talked about this before, is how incredibly diverse it is, right? Because you have all these religions, you have all of these languages, isolated people groups. So you don't have any sense of a single national identity. So no local ruler could sort of appeal for unity, be like, we are all, Christians, we are all Romans. No, like we all happen to live on the same part of the world, but you don't necessarily have anything in common with the people across the continent from you. There's also going to be a lot of corruption within the British East India Company, but also in the deals that they cut with the local rulers. Land taxes will increase in the Bengal, so like Bangladesh, when the British take control, and it will eventually lead to a 4-year famine, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. Because the British East India Company is using all of the land in Bengal to really grow opium to sell to China, that land is then not being used to grow food to feed the local population. 10 million people will die from this, right? So that's what I mean when corporations, their bottom line is to make money. It's not to necessarily provide for citizens. So the British East India Company is not necessarily managed well. They don't do the transition from joint stock company to transnational corporation super well. Eventually, they will be almost bankrupt, and the British Crown will really take control. So the company will be restructured and become accountable to the British government. By the 1790s, major social and political reforms have been instituted, and they started. The British government started to work through the British East India Company to influence India. So, for example, in the 1830s, the practice of sati will be prohibited. During this time as well, you'll see a lot of evangelical missionaries will use the British East India rule to migrate and spread the gospel about Christianity. There's pros and cons to this with missionaries, as always. On one hand, they are going to really advocate for the end of slave trade in India. Don't think African slaves, think more like harems, sex slaves, and slaves to be used sort of as a servant. They're going to advocate for the end of child marriages. They're going to promote Western education, but then they're also going to promote their cultural values about clothing and dress and social norms. So, as always, with missionaries, there's a bit of a mixed bag. So the British Raj is how we refer to when the British Crown rules over the Indian subcontinent. In 1818, the British East India Company controlled an empire with more people than all of Western Europe. The goal was to remake India in the British model. So you have more administrative reform, like the growth of private property. The goal here is Westernization, Anglicization, and modernization. They're going to introduce some new technology like the steam engine, but they had to really temper their interference with their Indian social and religious customs, because otherwise there might be a rebellion. If they tried to institute too much change, then they're going to have pushback. Under the British Raj, you will see that governments really began to expand and consolidate their power by using industrial powers. Things like railway lines in India, telegraph lines, the use of steamboats on rivers. Railways will really open up access to interior Indian markets and resources for British commercial interests. Raw materials will be brought from British colonies to the coastlines via railways and then shipped back to Britain to be manufactured. But it's important to understand that all of the infrastructure being built in India by the British is really designed to increase their economic prowess, right? So they're not building railways to facilitate the internal movement of people. They're building railways to facilitate the movement of resources to the coastlines. Nope, I just said that. So, under the Raj, under the British rule, the cities of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta will really become administrative centers. India will become a major outlet for British overseas investments and manufactured goods, particularly cotton and other textiles. Brits will create new jobs and expand crop production, but the cheap cotton goods from British textile mills will destroy the handicraft textile industry, so the cottage industry. You have to remember that India has been the main producer of cotton textiles for hundreds of years until the British take that role with the Industrial Revolution. So the industrial mills that within Britain really destroy an entire economy within this subcontinent. When you think about the social hierarchy, the British will put themselves at the top instead of actually changing the social system. So India is still going to be experiencing the caste system. And when the British are in charge, they look at this system and don't say, hey, like this is kind of messed up that there's this strict hierarchy, and even within each caste you have different jati, so you have sub rankings within each caste, and you can't intermarry or interact really well between them, right? They don't try to offer democracy or even sort of capitalism, like you can work your way up to be a rich man no matter who you are. No, they look at that and say, we're better than all of them, so who cares, right? So they take the caste system and just place themselves above everyone else. The British will adopt some pieces of Indian culture. There's a reason why tikka masala is like the national dish of Britain, but will maintain English as a spoken language. So that's why English is one of the main lingua francas of India. The British and Indian elites will work together, but always at the expense of ordinary people. The poor will really be hurt by new taxes and oppression. Women will still have few rights. British men commonly had sexual relations with Indian women, and mixed marriages wouldn't be uncommon under British rule. I want to make something clear. It's not like the Indians are just going to sit back and be oppressed. You have lots of small local rebellions. These rebellions will be put down primarily by the sepoys, but over time, there's going to be some concern about the loyalty of said sepoys. For good reason. In 1857, you have what's known as the Sepoy Rebellion. The Sepoy Rebellion is going to be dumb. It's super dumb. It's the result of such thoughtlessness. If the British had spent 2 seconds learning about their own soldiers, learning about the people that they were governing, they would have been able to avoid this. So, a couple things about how weapons worked in the 19th century. To fire a gun, you would have a cartridge. So the cartridge, it would be like waxed, greased paper, and inside would be gunpowder. So as you're getting ready to fire your gun, you'd put in the musket ball or whatever. I'm clearly an expert. And then you would, and you're holding the gun in one hand, you put in the bullet, and then with that same hand, you lift up this, greased cartridge and rip it open with your teeth. So then you can put the gunpowder into the gun and fire, right? Well, the rifle cartridges were greased with a mixture of pig and cattle fat. What are the two major religions in India? Hinduism and Islam. Muslims don't eat pork. Cows are sacred in Hinduism. So the fact that these cartridges are greased with pig and cattle fat means they're managing to violate, cross the taboo of two major religions, and thus upsetting all of the soldiers, right? The policy was quickly changed once the British sort of realized it, but the damage was done. The sepoys will revolt, and the revolt will end in just 1 year later as a British victory. Some Indian historians will call it the Revolution of 1857, which is an interesting way to remember history's interpretation, right? Depending on who is telling the story and their background, how you interpret actions will be really different. The Sepoy Revolt will ultimately lead to the dissolution of the British East India Company and the creation of the British Raj. This is a great video clip. It's actually a video clip from, I think, a documentary. But the documentary then includes a video clip from a Bollywood film. So ask yourself, what two British groups ruled in India? What was the Sepoy Rebellion? What was its effects? So let's talk a little bit about political reform and industrial impact. The Sepoy Rebellion and the creation of the British Raj is going to be a turning point. You will have a new centralized government, rapid economic growth, and a new sort of national consciousness. The British rule will guarantee Indian rights before the British law. They emphasize tradition and reform. So this is the era of Queen Victoria. She's known as the Empress of India. And the viceroys, the British men ruling in India, will live in luxury like old Mughal princes. So you have the creation of the Indian Civil Service, which is an elite professional class of officials who administered the government of British India. They were originally only well-educated British men, but gradually the Indian Civil Service will begin to include qualified Indian men. There was a test to keep them out, and then just good old-fashioned racism as well. You see that the British Crown invests in infrastructure, harbors, cities, irrigation canals, and other public works. This does help India's problem with famines. Infrastructure also includes railroads. So the railroads do allow for some movement of Indian people. It will also mean that different Indians will actually intermix with each other. So you will have Brahmins in a car standing side by side with a Kshatriya, right? Or a Vaishya. Or you'll have Muslim Indians on the same train as Hindus. You'll have women on the same train as men. So Indian society was sort of highly segregated. And on these railroads, you have the mixing of these different groups. But it also means you have the movement of disease. So you start to have these massive cholera outbreaks throughout India as well. The British will also build up telegraph lines to help govern such a large territory. In terms of economics, the main exports from British India will be cotton, opium, tea, silk, and sugar. And they will be importing manufactured goods. There's still not a lot of economic opportunity for women, apart from low-paying jobs and plantations like picking leaves for tea or prostitution. Over time, though, we are starting to see the emergence of Indian nationalism. this sense of a cohesive Indian identity and a need to have a shared identity to push back against the British. So the reforms the British will put in place will address some customs like child marriage, sati. They will allow women or widows to remarry, which was a taboo previously. It was actually illegal, not just a taboo. And they'll make female infanticide a crime. So previously, it wouldn't be illegal to kill a baby girl because sons were valued more. Nationalism starts to rise among the middle class, as there is a sense that why we're just as good, we're just as smart, we can govern ourselves. Why do we need the British? Why are we allowing the British to rule? So it's not just going to be a couple radicals, it will start to be a wider movement. So the Indian National Congress will be founded in 1885, and it is a movement and a political party created to demand greater Indian participation in the government. The membership will be primarily middle class, and their demands will be really pretty modest until World War I. After World War I, you will have men like Gandhi being part of the leadership, more poor people being part of the Indian National Congress, and their desire will primarily be self-governance. So let's think about the British in the Eastern Hemisphere in general. Part of the results of colonialism is when the Europeans fight each other and they defeat each other. The defeat means they get not just territory in Europe, but territory around the world from the colonies that European country might have controlled. So the British victories in the Napoleonic Wars will allow Britain to expand its control in South Africa, Southeast Asia, and Southern Caribbean. They will have defeated the French and Dutch forces and can go into areas that the French and the Dutch had controlled globally. So the Cape Colony will be really valuable to Britain. Think South Africa for Cape Colony. Its strategic importance as a supply station for the route to and from India. And we will talk a lot more about South Africa, so just hold that thought. You will also see the British establish a series of strategic outposts in Southeast Asia, specifically Singapore, Assam, and Burma. Assam's not an independent country, it's just a region now, but sort of part of Myanmar. In general, the British will be really much more interested in trade than territory. So, most of the new colonies were intended to serve as ports in a global shipping network that the British envisioned in terms of free trade, which is very different from the former mercantilist trade policy. You can see Adam Smith's ideas and laissez-faire being really present here. More lands were being drawn into the commercial networks created by the British. And part of the Industrial Revolution means the British need more markets and more raw materials. So these new lands being drawn into the commercial networks previously had not been colonized. They will become exporters of raw materials and importers of manufactured products. So this global commercial expansion was part of the technological revolution of the Industrial Revolution, right? Specifically, we're looking at these clipper ships, these ocean-going ships in the 19th century that will be super fast. It's because of the Industrial Revolution that you can build these super fast ships. They will use iron to fasten timbers together and huge canvas sails, which will allow shipbuilders to make larger, faster vessels that lowered the cost of shipping and thus stimulated maritime trade. You also have our white dominion colonies, obviously Canada, but also Australia and New Zealand. White dominion colonies were established in the 19th century with parliamentary governments and commercial economies that generally followed British culture. Australia will be established in 1788, and the British will really push back against and oppress the indigenous Aborigines living there. Australia will first be made a penal colony, so a place to send your prisoners. But over time, with its agricultural development and eventual gold discoveries, it will draw hundreds of thousands of European migrants. In general, the development of new ships and shipping will contribute to the colonization of Australia and New Zealand, and the British settlers who go there will displace the indigenous populations. So James Cook is a British naval officer and explorer, and he will first make contact with Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. As one might expect, the contact of Europeans with these places will introduce all kinds of new things, like diseases, like biological pathogens, fungus, rats, which will almost decimate the indigenous bird populations, snakes, animals. The unfamiliar diseases brought by the Europeans to these new places will substantially reduce the populations of the Aborigines and the Maori in New Zealand. Australia will be populated more quickly than New Zealand, in part because the Maori will fight back and will become quite a problem for settlers. So, one of the other things that we see in with this British Empire is the movement of peoples. So you see lots of migration around the world between different British colonies. Indians, Chinese, Africans will go overseas as laborers, especially as slavery disappears and there's a need for cheap labor on plantations and farms. There's a reason why British Guiana has a significant Hindu population. It's because Indians will go from British India to British Guiana. The British sugar plantations will really be the principal destination for these migrants. A lot of these workers would serve under contracts as indentured servants. And part of what it would include would be a small salary, payment for travel, as well as housing and medical care. So you can see sort of our massive population movements in the 19th century. All right, this is a great crash course. I really encourage you to watch it. It will really look at this specifically. All right, let's do a couple practice questions to finish up. Why was the Sepoy Rebellion a turning point in the history of India? Although the British East India Company was founded in 1600, the British gradually colonized India by... I'm running out of sleeping baby. The British East India Company transformed the Indian economy by exporting raw cotton to Britain. So, please compare the processes by which state power shifted in India between 1750 and 1900. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.